I previously discussed how the food industry of the early part of the 20th century could be characterized as one in which many independent companies produced, processed, and packaged primarily raw ingredients for market. With the industry's shift to standardization and commercialization of convenience foods, the distance between the food source and the consumer increased greatly. As we start to evaluate the outcomes of the food industry's shift, we find many more forces influencing political, geographic, economic, and social aspects of food. We can also assess the rise of and concerns over fast food restaurants and, in the other virtual lecture for this week, ready-to-eat packaged food. In this lecture, we will learn about the retail or restaurant side of the supply chain and just how interconnected it was during the Cold War era. To do so, we will place our focus on fast food, diners, lunch counters, and even grocery stores. So hang on as we look at fast food and fast cars. Originally what consumers considered as fast food were items such as hot dogs and hamburgers sold at fairs, circuses, lunch counters, and by vendors with street carts. Consumers thought of these as low-quality foods. The meat was assumed, sometimes accurately, to have come from slaughterhouse scraps and spoiled meat. A very fine line exists between early fast food restaurants and lunch wagons. Commercial production of lunch wagons began before the turn of the century, just under an hour's drive west of Boston, in Worcester, Massachusetts. Some looked more like large enclosed wagons with many windows, while others looked like silver train cars. Around 1925, lunch wagons gained the common name of diners. By this time, they had also become a common sight in downtown locations along the East Coast. Much like the popular food trucks seen in major downtown areas such as in Portland, Oregon, and Washington, D.C. and New York, these dining facilities were portable, depending on where the demand was, not on real estate. They carried a lower overhead and could, in turn, offer lower costs to customers. With Americans' involvement in World War II came the end of diner wagon production. Oh, hello. You can still find a lot of these diners here and there. In fact, right near Boston, where Northeastern University is, you can find some in Somerville and in Salem, Massachusetts, some dating back to the 30s. This one is Deb's Diner in Salem, Massachusetts. Along with diners, restaurants, and restaurant chains continued to grow and develop across the country. In 1921, White Castle began in Wichita, Kansas. To change the public perception of the burgers they sold, they structured their restaurants such that customers could see the food being prepared. Also, perhaps this fast food startup took a cue from the food industry giants from around the time that Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle took American consumers by storm. Companies including Franco-American, Swift and Company, and even Campbell Soups wanted to create an image of cleanliness and wholesomeness. Many in the food industry adopted branding or advertising logos that included the use of women or children, often cherub-like images, dressed in clean chef's whites, the white toque hat and white double-breasted jacket. These images are still in use today. So what did the people behind White Castle do? Well, their choice in name of White Castle and their decision to paint their buildings white were two deliberate efforts which succeeded in selling the idea of cleanliness in fast food. An interesting side note about the early fast food restaurants and diners, which predate almost all other fast food chains we know today, is that the food industry was impacted by many of the non-industrial factors we previously discussed. During the Great Depression, while few diners started their business, such as Friendly's in 1935, food availability was such that restaurants changed what menu items they could offer. White Castle sold bean soup, cheese sandwiches, and eggs. During World War II, however, restaurants faced even more drastic changes. Friendly's closed down their operations throughout the war. Similarly, White Castle witnessed the wartime economic impacts of severe food and labor shortages. Again, the chain sold hot dogs and eggs due to meat rationing. After the war, the original fast food chain rebounded financially and grew in size with the surge in auto sales and highways. In fact, the entire fast food industry not only grew, but exploded. Between the 1940s and the 1960s, America gained several fast food and diner chains which still exist today. The long list of familiar names includes Dairy Queen, 1940, McDonald's, 1948, Jack in the Box, 1951, Kentucky Fried Chicken, 1952, Denny's, 1953, Burger King, 1953, Carl's Jr., 1954, Waffle House, 1955, Pizza Hut, 1958, the International House of Pancakes, also known as IHOP, 1958, Straw Hat Pizza, 1959, Hardee's, 1960, Wiener Schnitzel, 1961, Taco Bell, gong, 1962, Subway, 1965, Cracker Barrel, 1969, Long John Silver's, 1969, Wendy's, 1969. McDonald's was the first restaurant to use the assembly line system to support the supply side of ready burgers. But another form of assembly line, for the demand side, exponentially increased their business. In 1956, Congress approved and Eisenhower signed into law the Federal or Interstate Highway Act. Post-World War II, America saw the rise of suburbs and young families with their fascination for cars on the move. Within a year, the Soviet Union launched their Sputnik satellite into orbit. While most thought little of the Cold War up till now, the space race brought foreign clashes and threats much closer to home and into the living room via the television. Legislators considered the construction of highways essential to the support of our national defense. This system of roads naturally resulted in more than simply the development of suburbs. Smaller grocery stores evolved into supermarkets, where the smaller specialty stores were now consolidated into large markets. In 1950, Northgate Shopping Mall, the first suburban mall-type shopping center in the U.S., opened just north of Seattle, Washington, and regional shopping centers soon sprung up across the country. Many other new businesses sprouted up along the roads, including restaurants, most notably fast food chains. The intersection of the new highways and America's love for fast cars drove restaurants to cater to customers who didn't even want to leave their cars to eat. Diners, the ones larger than the early wagons, were moved to or built along the highways. Way before Twitter, hashtag, Facebook, Instagram, Foursquare, etc. Heck, before the internet, and only in the earliest days of television, these restaurants had to connect with the demand side to do business. Many offered free matchbooks, a practice not too popular today, as a way of advertising, like business cards on the American road. You know, I haven't seen this in a very long time, but I do remember the abundance of free matchbooks at the very same restaurants we go to today. Even food companies and food distributors offered matchbooks. One of my favorites is the Disneyland advertisement that cross-promotes Fritos on a matchbook. Many restaurants also sold postcards depicting themselves as an oasis on the open road, a must-see destination. Many themed restaurants or ethnic food specialty restaurants spread to the West Coast during this era. Their goal was to catch the eyes of the countless drivers passing by. Sometimes, owners turn novelties into something far worse than an eyesore. One example was Coon Chicken Inn, a chain of 3 restaurants that existed between the 1920s and 1950s in Salt Lake City, Utah, Portland, Oregon, and in Seattle, Washington. Now, the word coon is a racial slur referring to African Americans in a very negative way. I use this only in the context of talking about history. These restaurants did exist during the last few decades before the Civil Rights Movement, an era known for Jim Crow laws, which supported discrimination and segregation. This word was not only visible as the restaurant's name, but also as visual elements used by the chain. The image of the quote-unquote head of a Negro with mouth open and large white teeth on which the word coon is painted welcomed customers through the restaurant's front doors. The image even appeared on plates, menus, advertising, and on promotional items such as matches. This profitable restaurant eventually closed, but not before feeling the impact from laborers and consumers. Many restaurants, even grocery stores, have faced protests for anti-union treatment, unfair labor policies, and discrimination like that which Coon Chicken Inn faced. Unions picketed, customers decided to shop or eat elsewhere, and, after the media caught wind of tensions between customers and retailers/restaurants, they ran photos, stories, and letters to the editor. The intersection of the civil rights movement and the food industry was not seen solely in restaurants and grocery stores. I should also bring in a brief discussion of lunch counters. We rarely see these establishments anymore, though one is on exhibit at the Smithsonian Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. Also called luncheonettes, these were similar to a small diner but located inside major department stores and even in drugstores. Some early forms of lunch counters are known to have existed as far back as the 1860s, just after the Civil War. Ironically, a Woolworth's department store in Greensboro, North Carolina, had a lunch counter which took a place front and center in a major event in the civil rights movement 100 years later. On the 1st of February, 1960, 4 college students sat down at the lunch counter and asked for service just as did everyone else. However, these customers were African American. Their request was refused. When asked to leave, the 4 remained seated, triggering other passive resistance and peaceful sit-downs along the road to racial equality with the passage of the Civil Rights Act 50 years ago in 1964. These Cold War examples of change in fast food restaurants, diners, lunch counters, and grocery stores show how the food industry impacts and has long been impacted by political, geographic, economic, and social factors. Today, all industries, including the food industry, are associated with concerns over labor, wages, benefits, and other modern issues of discrimination and inequality. Just as political decisions and advancements in technology impacted the food industry during the Cold War, modern items such as the internet, biotechnology, and food security are shaping the industry at this moment. These issues, as we will see next week, have been joined by other concerns from the consumer, as well as those from farmers and others in the supply chain.